She doesn't speak Arabic. That was the first thing Kessler said when the briefing room went quiet. Not as a question, as a verdict. Sergeant First Class Dana Lowe, no. That name is in the file. Let me start again. She doesn't speak Arabic. That was the first thing Kessler said when the briefing room went quiet. Not as a question, as a verdict. He said it the way men say things they've already decided, the way you announce weather. Sergeant Nolan doesn't speak Arabic, so Sergeant Nolan doesn't go in. And that was the end of it, officially. The briefing moved on, the room moved on. Sergeant First Class Claire Nolan sat in the third chair from the left and said nothing, because she had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing she could do in a room like that one was say exactly what she was thinking. She spoke enough Arabic to matter. She always had. Before we go any further, if you're watching this right now, subscribe to Scout Stories and follow this all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Now let's get into it. The village of Ash-Shira sat in a shallow depression in the northern Syrian interior, 4 hours by road from the nearest coalition forward operating base and about 40 minutes by air, if the air was cooperating, which it rarely did in the late weeks of February. Nolan had studied it for 9 days. She knew the well in the eastern quarter, the two-story building on the north road that used to be a school, the generator pattern that cut out at midnight and resumed at 4. She knew which rooftop had the best angle on the courtyard and which alley ran parallel to the wall long enough to use as an approach route. She knew all of it because her job officially was signals intelligence. She sat in a trailer 2 kilometers from the wire and listened and logged and translated when she was asked, which was not as often as her accuracy warranted, and she built a picture of Ash-Shira out of frequencies and voices and the specific pattern of radio silence that tells you more than any transmission ever could. What she knew 9 days in was this. There was a man in that village named Barakat. He was not a local. He had arrived 16 days before Nolan started listening, and in those 16 days, he had received 4 separate package deliveries on a frequency used by a network that coalition intelligence had been trying to locate for 2 years. He was careful. He rotated his transmit times, changed channels, never stayed on long enough to be pinned. But he made one mistake, the same mistake every careful person eventually made. He had a routine, not in his transmissions, in his movements. Every third night, between 2200 and 2230, someone walked from the northern building to the generator housing at the south end of the courtyard and back. 16 minutes, door to door. Nolan had logged it 7 times. 7 out of 7. Barakat was either the node they had been looking for, or he was protecting the person who was. She had put this in a written assessment. The assessment had been received, acknowledged, and filed. Kessler had briefed the command element on the network location 3 days later, using different language and no attribution. She had been in the back of that briefing room too, and she had watched it happen. And she had added it to a list she kept in her head of things she was not yet done with. The mission was straightforward, as missions in that part of the world went. A 4-person reconnaissance element would insert by vehicle 2 kilometers out, move on foot to the edge of the village, confirm Barakat's presence visually, relay coordinates, and extract before the 2200 window. No engagement, no entry. Kessler led the element. Sergeant Price was on comms. Specialist Malloy was the driver. And then there was Nolan, who was not on the manifest at all, officially, but who had asked to go and been told no by Kessler, and yes by the operations officer who outranked him, and so had been added to the vehicle in a way that Kessler had not forgotten and would not forget. They inserted at 1900. The road was bad and the vehicle was worse, and by the time they dismounted 2 kilometers out, the sky had gone the particular flat gray that precedes a dust event. Not a storm. Worse than a storm, a moving wall of suspended particulate that turned visibility into something theoretical. Nolan had seen it happen before, in training in the first deployment. She had not been in it on foot in open ground at night, with an element that was already behind schedule. They moved anyway. Kessler set the pace and the pace was wrong. Too fast for the terrain, the kind of speed that tells you a man is trying to outrun a problem he knows is coming rather than solving it. Nolan said nothing. She moved with the element and kept her eyes on the ground ahead and the angles to her left, and she was the one who saw the tripwire. She said wire and grabbed Price's sleeve in the same moment, and Price stopped, and the person who did not stop was Malloy, who was 2 steps ahead and whose boot came down on the secondary trigger, buried in the dirt 6 inches past the wire. The blast was not large. It did not need to be. It was designed for legs, and it did exactly what it was designed to do. Malloy went down. Price went left into the ditch. Kessler hit the ground and rolled and came up with his weapon, and there was nothing to shoot at because there was no ambush. There was just a mine and a man on the ground, and the dust event arriving 40 minutes earlier than any of them had expected. Nolan was already at Malloy. She had her kit open before she fully registered what she was doing, training moving her hands, while her brain was still sorting through the noise and the impact and the smell. Malloy's right leg was wrong from the knee down. She applied the tourniquet the way she had been drilled, high and tight, talking to him the whole time in the flat, calm voice that her first trauma instructor had told her was worth 10 milligrams of morphine if you used it right. She got the bleeding controlled. She got Malloy's assessment done. She looked up at Kessler and said, "He needs a bird. 20 minutes, maybe 30. We can't call a bird," Kessler said. "Not until we confirm the objective. He will not last until the objective. That's not your call, Nolan." It was nobody's call, she wanted to argue. It was a medical fact and she had just stated it. But Kessler was already on the radio, and what he was saying was not calling for an extraction. He was reporting the contact. He was reporting the delay. He was doing the math that Nolan already knew produced the wrong answer. Price was beside her, checking the dressing, not looking at Kessler. In a low voice too quiet to carry, he said, "Can you hold this?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Then I'll get comms up." She held it. Malloy was conscious, which was both better and worse than unconscious, because it meant he was present for what was happening to him, and also that he could hear what was being said 10 feet away. Nolan kept her voice steady and her hands moving, and she did not let him look south, where Kessler was standing with back to them. The dust hit at 2100. It did not arrive gradually. It arrived the way a decision arrives when you have been putting it off too long all at once, with complete commitment. Visibility dropped to less than 10 meters, and the radio went to static and then to nothing. And somewhere in the transition, Kessler made a call that Nolan did not hear clearly, and that she would spend considerable time afterward reconstructing from its consequences. He moved the element forward. Malloy could not walk. Price could not carry him and operate comms. Nolan was the only one whose hands were free, which meant Nolan was the one who was going to stay with Malloy, while Kessler and Price pushed to the objective. She was told this, not asked. Kessler did not look at her when he said it. He said they would be back in 40 minutes and that she should keep the radio on and stay low and not move unless she had to. He said, in a voice she would remember very precisely later, "If we're not back in an hour, make a judgment call." Then he and Price disappeared into the dust. Nolan looked at Malloy. Malloy looked at the sky through the dust. She pressed her fingers against the tourniquet and checked the time and began to count. The 40 minutes became an hour. The hour became 90 minutes. The radio stayed static, and Malloy's breathing stayed shallow, but present, and Nolan stayed exactly where she was, because staying was the only option that kept Malloy alive, and Malloy staying alive was not negotiable. At the 90-minute mark, she assessed what she had. Her personal weapon, a Mk18 CQBR with a suppressor and a magnified optic she'd mounted herself the previous week. 30 rounds in the magazine, 2 spares on her kit. Her sidearm, a SIG P320 with 1 spare, her radio on the coalition frequency, dead but with a secondary battery she hadn't touched yet. A trauma kit, mostly used, water for 6 hours, 2 signal flares, and 9 days of knowing exactly how this village was laid out. She made Malloy as secure as she could. She told him what she was doing and why. She told him she was going to come back and that she needed him to stay quiet and stay still and keep his hand on the dressing even if it hurt, especially if it hurt. He said, "What are you going to do?" She said, "Find out what happened to the team." He said, "Nolan, I know," she said. "I'll be back." She moved into the dust. She had studied this approach for 9 days, but she had never walked it. And there is a difference between knowing a place on a map and knowing it under your feet in the dark and reduced visibility with the wind pushing grit into every gap in your clothing. She closed the distance to the village perimeter in 22 minutes, slower than she'd wanted, faster than was probably wise. She moved by memory and by the particular way the terrain changed under her boots. The soft sand giving way to packed earth, the packed earth to gravel, the gravel to the irregular stones of a footpath that had been there long before anyone had started fighting over the region it ran through. At the wall, she stopped. She had 40 seconds of stillness, just listening, The way she'd been taught to listen when she worked signals, the way you empty yourself of your own noise and let the environment speak. What she heard, voices, two of them male, speaking in Arabic, with a regional accent she had learned to identify from recordings. They were not having a casual conversation. They were having the clipped, low, compressed conversation of men who were managing a situation and did not like the situation they were managing. She understood enough. Two men down. Kessler and Price had been taken. Not killed, she parsed from the tone and the specific words she caught. The word she heard was asset, used twice, which in this context meant prisoner. She moved along the wall to the gap she had identified in the satellite imagery, the place where the original mud brick construction had been repaired badly with cinder block and left a section of lower wall she could use. She was over it before she finished the decision to go over it, moving on instinct and training, the two things that by this point in her career had become largely indistinguishable. Inside the wall, she pressed flat against the interior and let her eyes adjust, and gave herself exactly 30 seconds of absolute stillness before she moved again. 30 seconds in which she ran the assessment. Where were Kessler and Price being held? Where was Barakat? How many personnel were in this compound? What did she have versus what she needed? What she needed was a radio that worked. The northern building had a communication setup. She had inferred this from 9 days of signals. The transmissions came from a fixed point that corresponded to its location on the satellite image, and the power draw pattern she'd identified from the generator logs suggested sustained equipment operation. There would be a working radio in that building. There would also be at minimum 3 people between her and it. She started moving. The first guard post was at the corner of the courtyard, where the original structure met the newer addition. One man, leaning against the wall with the particular posture of someone whose attention had been narrowed by routine to almost nothing. She watched his pattern for 4 minutes. He was not doing anything resembling a real patrol. He was standing. Occasionally, he shifted his weight. Every few minutes, he turned his head south, toward where the dust was, as if expecting something to emerge from it. She came at him from the north, from his blind side, and it was quick and it was quiet, and she lowered him gently because sound traveled in the dust in unpredictable ways, and she had no interest in testing which direction it would travel tonight. The courtyard was larger than the satellite image had suggested, or she was covering it differently than she'd imagined, which was the same problem in different clothing. She found the generator housing at the south end without difficulty, which meant she had confirmed the geometry, which meant the northern building was where the satellite image said it was. She moved north. The door to the northern building was not locked. This was not as surprising as it might seem. It was not locked because whoever was inside was confident that the perimeter was sufficient, which was a confidence that was in the process of being revised. She went in low and fast and took the room in 3 seconds. 2 operators at a long table with equipment, one man standing at a window, looking out into the dust with his back to her. Not Barakat. She knew Barakat's voice from the recordings. She had cataloged it the way you catalog something you intend to find eventually. The 2 operators went down in the order of their threat, which was quick and precise and left them present but not operational. The man at the window turned. He was older than the operators. He had the bearing of someone who was used to being in charge of something and the expression of someone who had just watched that certainty leave the room. She said one word in Arabic, the word for sit. He sat. She crossed to the equipment. She found the radio on the coalition emergency frequency in the time it took her to run through the panel systematically, which was 45 seconds. She checked the signal. There was enough. She keyed the transmit. What she said in the flat, clear voice she had developed over 7 years of talking into radios in situations where the first principle was precision. She gave her call sign, her position, the number of coalition personnel she believed were being held, and their status as of 90 minutes ago, the grid reference for the building she was currently in, and the request for immediate extraction with a medical priority for a casualty at a position she gave in 6-digit coordinates. The duty officer came back in less than a minute. He asked for verification. She said, "My verification is that I am inside the building, and the equipment I'm transmitting from will be in coalition hands within 3 hours, or this conversation will have been its own evidence. Write down the coordinates. I'll wait." He wrote them down. She waited. 3 minutes of static and overlapping voices at the other end. Then, "Call sign Nomad, we have your position flagged. Can you confirm personnel count at your location? She looked at the man sitting against the wall. He was watching her with an expression she recognized from other men in other difficult rooms. The expression of someone who is recalculating what kind of person they are dealing with and arriving at an answer that is changing other answers. Working on it, she said. She turned to the man. She spoke in Arabic, slowly, using the words she was most certain of, filling gaps with her hands when the vocabulary ran out. She asked him where the prisoners were. He said nothing. She asked him where Barakat was. At that name, something changed in his face, a small tightening, a micro-adjustment. He knew the name. She set her hand on the radio, not as a threat, just as a fact. She said, still in Arabic, you can tell me now, or you can tell the people who are coming in 3 hours. And the people who are coming in 3 hours will have less patience and more paperwork, he told her. Kessler and Price were in the lower room of the adjacent building, the old school. There were 2 guards. Barakat was in the same building, upper floor. She looked at the man. She said, in English, this time, because her Arabic was running out, stay here. Don't touch the equipment. Don't raise your voice. She paused. If someone comes through that door in the next 10 minutes who isn't me, tell them I went south. He blinked. Then he nodded. Once, the nod of a man who has decided that cooperation is the only reasonable position and has made his peace with what that says about him. She went out the side window. The adjacent building was 30 meters east. She covered it in less than a minute, moving low and fast along the wall, using the dust as cover the way she had used it since she arrived. As a constant, as a given, as a condition to work within, rather than a problem to solve. The lower room had 1 door and 2 windows. She took a window. She could see Kessler sitting with his back against the far wall, his hands zip-tied in front of him. Price was to his left, conscious, a cut above his eye that had bled down his face and dried. 2 guards, 1 near the door, 1 in the center of the room in a chair that he had turned around and was sitting on backwards, which told her about his alertness level and also about his training. She did not have a clean shot through the window without risk to Kessler and Price. She thought about this for the 11 seconds she could afford to think about it, and then she moved to the door. She went through it, on the guard's blind side, the one in the chair, because the chair made him slow, and she was not slow. The one near the door had time to turn, and not enough time after that, and it was over in the specific, fast irreversibility of things that cannot be undone, and then it was quiet. Kessler looked at her. She was already cutting the zip ties. She gave Price the secondary battery for his radio. She said quietly, 2 coalition personnel secured. Primary target is on the upper floor. I need 2 minutes. Kessler said, Nolan, 2 minutes, she said. Get comms up. She went upstairs. Barakat was alone. That told her something. A man who keeps himself away from his own security is either very confident or very afraid. And the man sitting at the small table with 3 phones in front of him and the posture of someone who was monitoring something urgent was neither. He was calculating. She had walked into a room in the middle of someone else's calculation, and the calculation stopped the moment she came through the door. He looked at her. He was younger than she had expected from the voice recordings. Mid-30s, methodical face, the kind of face that gave nothing immediately. She had her weapon on him. He had his hands flat on the table. She said in Arabic, the 6 words she had prepared for this exact moment. Who else knows the next location? The question was not random. She had constructed it over 9 days of listening, from a single incomplete transmission she had logged and flagged and written a report about that had been filed without action. The transmission had referenced a secondary location. She didn't have the location. She had the reference. She had been waiting for the source. Barakat looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she could hear Price's voice from downstairs, the flat, rapid cadence of a man talking into a radio with purpose. Long enough that she heard, from somewhere outside, the distant sound she had been listening for since she keyed the transmit, the specific low percussion of rotors, still far away but coming. Barakat said, in English that was better than she had expected, "You speak Arabic." "Some," she said. "They told me the woman on signals didn't speak Arabic." "They were wrong," she said. Something moved across his face, not respect. Something more complicated than respect. The expression of a man revising a structural assumption and watching everything built on top of it shift. "What do you want to know?" he said. She told him. He told her. She was back downstairs in 4 minutes. Kessler was on his feet, the zip marks still visible on his wrists, the radio in Price's hands cycling through the coalition frequency. He looked at her when she came down. He looked at her the way she had seen men look at things they had categorized incorrectly and were in the process of recategorizing, which was not an expression she had ever learned to enjoy and still had not. "Bird is 6 minutes out," Price said. "We need to move," she said. "What did you get upstairs?" Kessler said. "I'll brief at the First Nolan. Malloy is 2 kilometers south with a tourniquet I applied 90 minutes ago," she said, flat and clean. "We move." They moved. Malloy was where she had left him. He was conscious, and his hand was on the dressing, and when she came out of the dust, he looked at her with the particular expression of a person who had been told they were not going to be abandoned and had spent 90 minutes wondering if that was true. "I told you," she said. "Yeah," he said. They got him to the LZ on the secondary battery signal light she activated, and the helicopter sat down 3 minutes later clearing. That was barely a clearing, and the crew chief jumped out and took in the scene with the fast professional inventory of a person who had seen worse, and was focused entirely on the current problem. Malloy went on the Bird first, then Price, then Kessler. Nolan was last, which was how she'd planned it, because she had been counting from the moment she left Malloy, and she knew her timeline, and she knew what she had not yet transmitted. And she used the 30 seconds between everyone else boarding and her own turn to pull out the notes she had written on her forearm in the building. The secondary location, the contact protocol, the frequency, and the timing that Barakat had given her, and she relayed every word of it on the Coalition emergency channel before she stepped onto the aircraft. The duty officer said, "Can you authenticate that?" she said. "Run the frequency against your logs from the last 14 months. You'll find 6 matches. That's your authentication." She got on the helicopter. The flight to Fob Galway took 31 minutes. She was conscious for all of it, which was not a punishment and was not a relief, but was simply a fact. The way facts accumulate when a situation is over, and the body begins the process of understanding what it has been asked to do. Her hands were steady. She checked them the way she always checked, and they were steady. And she noted this the way she noted all useful data, and looked out the window at the dark and the dust below and began methodically to prepare what she was going to say when the helicopter landed. The medical team at Fob Galway took Malloy first, which was correct and expected, and the intelligence officer took Price second, which was also expected. And Kessler had been met at the landing pad by a major who outranked them both and whose face told a story that Nolan read accurately and filed without comment. No one met Nolan. She walked herself to the medical bay, had her hands checked for the dust contamination that had worked into a cut on her left palm during the wall crossing, and sat in the plastic chair that was bolted to the floor outside the triage area, and waited, because waiting was the skill she was best at, and she had decided that what was going to happen next needed to happen on her own schedule. The intelligence officer found her 40 minutes later. His name was Croft. She had seen him in briefings. He was the kind of man who kept a very flat expression as a professional tool, and who she had therefore learned to read in the margins. The way he set his tablet down, the angle of his approach, whether he sat or remained standing, he sat. That told her something. He said, "The frequency you transmitted before you boarded. We ran it against the logs." She waited. 14 matches, he said. "Not 6. She said nothing. "The secondary location you gave us." He looked at his tablet. "Our analysis team has been looking for this location for 8 months. It corresponds to a node we flagged as dark 6 months ago." He set the tablet face down on his knee. "We have a team ready to move within the hour. The window Barakat gave you puts us 40 minutes ahead of their next scheduled transmission. If that intelligence is accurate, it's accurate," she said. He looked at her. The flat expression had developed a small alteration at its edges, the way flat things develop alterations when they are pressed against something they did not expect to encounter. "How certain are you?" "Certain enough that I transmitted it before I got on the helicopter," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up his tablet. "We're going to need a full debrief, everything from the entry point forward, in sequence, with timestamps where you have them. I have them all," she said. He almost said something. She watched him decide not to, and then decide that not saying it was itself a statement, and then decide that the statement was appropriate. 40 minutes, he said. "Operations Center." He left. She sat for another 5 minutes, alone in the plastic chair, and let the things she had been not feeling settle into the places where they would be carried. Because you didn't feel them in the field. Not if you were serious, and she was very serious. But they went somewhere, they always went somewhere, and where they went was wait. the specific accumulating weight of things done under pressure that could not be undone. Malloy's leg, Kessler's wrists, the guard in the chair, Barakat's face when she told him what she wanted to know. She carried the weight the way she carried everything. Forward. One more step. The next objective. The thing after the thing that just happened. She stood up and went to the operations center. The debrief took 2 hours. She was precise and sequential, and she answered every question without embellishment, including the questions about entry, which produced a silence in the room that she did not fill, and the questions about the upper floor, which produced a different silence of a different quality. When it was done, Croft thanked her in the way that men thank people when they are processing a recalibration they haven't finished yet, and she went back to her bunk and sat on it and did not sleep. At 0400, her radio crackled. The secondary node had been active. The coalition team that moved on it had found it and what they had found there. Croft used the phrase significant intelligence capture in the flat professional language of someone describing something he was still metabolizing, had led to 2 immediate operational leads and a third that was pending verification. He also said, almost as an afterthought, in a voice that was not an afterthought, the network map. The full picture. What you pulled out of that building combined with what we found at the node. Our analysis lead says it's the most complete signals picture of this network we've had in 2 years. She said, I know. A pause. I know you know, he said. She said nothing. Sergeant Nolan. His voice changed, not significantly, but enough. The assessment you filed 9 days ago. The one with the pattern analysis on Barakat? Yes, it was correct. All of it. Another pause. I want you to know that I'm aware it was briefed without attribution. She waited. That's being corrected, he said. She held the radio for a moment. Outside, the base was beginning its pre-dawn cycle, the sounds of a place that did not stop, that ran through the dark hours, the same as the daylight hours, with the same machinery and the same urgency and the same indifference to the specific weight any one person in it was carrying. And Malloy? She said. In surgery, prognosis is good, he'll keep the leg. She let out one breath, one slow, controlled breath that she had been holding in one form or another since she had applied that tourniquet in the dark with the dust arriving. Thank you, she said. Get some sleep, Croft said. We have a meeting at 0900. Command level. They want the full picture from you directly, she said. I'll be there. She set the radio down. She lay back on the bunk and looked at the ceiling, which was the same ceiling she had looked at for 9 days, while she built the picture of Ash Shira, piece by piece out of frequencies and silences, and the particular way a voice changes when it thinks it is not being understood. She had been understood. That was what they had not counted on, any of them. Not Kessler, who had kept her off the manifest until someone with more authority put her back on. Not the briefing room that had taken 9 days of her analysis and attributed it somewhere else. Not Barakat, who had operated for 14 months on the assumption that the woman listening to his frequencies did not have enough Arabic to matter. She had always had enough. She had always been enough. The people who had needed to be corrected on that point were in the process of being corrected. At 0900, she walked into a command-level briefing room for the first time in 7 years of signals work. And when the general sitting at the head of the table asked who had produced the initial pattern assessment on Barakat, the officer beside him said Sergeant Nolan, without hesitation, without pause, without looking at anyone else in the room to check whether saying it was permitted. She sat in the first chair to the left of the general, not the back row, not the margins. She told them everything she knew. She told them what came next.